Hello. Thanks. Great to see all of you here. Thank you for coming out to this event and for buying the book. And your attendance at these events is what lets us keep having them and keep having great authors come to our store. So we really appreciate that. This evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from Terry Virts about his book, To Astronaut, An Insider's Guide to Leaving Planet Earth. Colonel Terry Virts was selected by NASA in 2000 to be pilot of STS-130, mission aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour. In March 2015, Virts assumed command of the International Space Station and spent over 200 days on it. Virts is one of the stars and photographers of the IMAX film A Beautiful Planet, released in April 2016. He is the author of The Astronaut's Guide to Leaving the Planet, To Astronaut, and A View from Above. We hope you enjoy the event. Thank you, and remember you can grab a copy of To Astronaut or Terry's new kids book, The Astronaut's Guide to Leaving the Planet, Everything You Need to Know from Training to Re-Entry, for the future space travelers in your life. Thanks, Terry.
Thanks, and thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Normally when I do speaking, I have a presentation, I show slides and talk about my space mission, but I want to start off tonight by talking about writing a book, which is something that I was probably the least likely to write a book when I was your age. In high school, I tortured my poor English teachers, and for years after, I'd go back and talk to kids, and anyway, I would always find my English teachers and apologize again, like, I'm sorry I sucked so much when I was a kid. But I was really interested in math and science, and I didn't really think that English mattered. And now that I'm older, I realize that it's all that really matters. Like, if you can't communicate what you're doing, it doesn't matter what you did, because no one's going to know about it. And so my life has really changed a lot. When I left NASA in 5 or 6 years ago, the first thing I knew I wanted to write a book, and we talked to National Geographic, and I thought, well, I'd like to do that Geo book. And ironically, they literally had just had a staff meeting where they said, we need to do another space book, because it had been 20 years. JAP did one in the 90s. And so when I was leaving NASA, they were ready for one. So I wrote View from Above, and it was supposed to be a 2018 book. And so I literally retired. I went and set my alarm, and at 8 a.m. I was typing. And then by lunchtime I was done. Went to the pool, and then next morning I set my alarm at 8 a.m. I was typing, and then by noon I was done. And in 2 weeks I had written the entire book. It was about 40,000 words, so it wasn't War and Peace, but it was a book. And the other thing is, I wrote it. I'll share a secret with you guys. Astronauts' books are not written by the astronaut. They have ghostwriters. But I really wanted to write this book because, to prove I could do it, because I used to be such a bad English student, but just to make sure the stories were told in my voice. So when I turned my manuscript in 2 weeks later, the first draft, they almost passed out. They were like, what? And so anyway, my publishing date got moved up by a year. Literally, we went from fall of 18 to fall of 17. And that was a really cool book. It was a photography book, but it was stories from space. And that was a great experience. And when I was done with that, it's like I ran a marathon, and that was a nice box to check, but then I ran a second one, and after I wrote my second one, I felt like a marathoner. Like, if you run a marathon, you ran a marathon, but if you do two, then you're a marathoner. So with books, everybody can write a book, but I think if you write two, then you're an author, right? So I wanted to write another one. And I had a friend of mine who was a Navy SEAL, and he had just done this book called 100 Deadly Skills, which is really cool. You learn how to kill people and how to evade to see if someone's tailing you. And anyway, it's kind of like a James Bond book. And we got to talking, and I thought maybe I'll write a book similar to that for astronauts. And he recommended, there's a Stephen King book, and I'm not a Stephen King fan. I just never read Stephen King, but he wrote a book called On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft, and it's the best book. It's a spectacular book. It is really good for how to write. So if anybody here wants to write, I highly recommend that. He says, cut your words and don't use adverbs. Those are his two pieces of advice. It was a really good book that helped me become an author, I think a better author. So I ended up writing, when I had this idea for this book, it was like 1 a.m. and I had my iPhone, so I hit and I knew this idea that I wanted to write a chapter about. So I hit the record button and I just narrated it to myself while I was laying in bed and emailed that to myself. And that was the chapter. If you have How to Astronaut, there's a chapter called It Was a Long 200 Days. So that was the first, that was the first chapter that I read. Sorry, I have this chronic cough that I've had since I was in space, actually. And it went away during COVID because I don't know why, because I was at home and I wasn't getting viruses or whatever, but now that I'm back out in the world, now this cough is back. So I wanted to write a book that was fun and funny, and like the goal for How to Astronaut is for you to say wow and laugh. It's definitely not a space nerd book. It's for men, women, old, young. You don't have to be an aerospace engineer to like it, hopefully. And so there are 51 short essays about different topics about spaceflight. Some of them you'd expect, like how do you put a spacesuit on, or how do you train for launch in the space shuttle, or how do you land a space shuttle, things like that. And some of them you wouldn't expect, like It Was a Long 200-Day chapter, or what do you do with a dead body if your crewmate dies? What are you going to do with that? Or are there aliens? So that's kind of a mix of popular, your expected questions and unexpected. And I was really excited about this book. So I wrote this book very differently. I'm traveling a lot for speaking, and so I'm on airplanes all the time. So basically I wrote a chapter per airplane flight. I can sit there, get my laptop out, and just write the chapter. So it took me, however long it took, 51 flights for me to get to get all those chapters done. But that process took a little bit longer. It's also probably 100,000 words. I forgot, something like that. It's more words than the first one. But I love this book. I was really proud of it. And then our release date was October 2020. So that was like not the best time to release a book. If anybody in here is an author, you know what I'm talking about. Or if you're a bookstore owner, the fall of 2020 books. That was not my call sign should be lucky after doing that. But it was great. It was fun, and life went on. And what I really, the next thing that I really want to do is do a kid's book, because when I was 3 or 4 or 5, the first book I ever really read was a board book about Apollo, one of those cardboard, 1 line per page. We all read them as little kids, and I decided I wanted to be an astronaut when I was little, and so I grew up with posters of airplanes and rockets on my wall because of that book. And then when I was 13, when I was like some of the kids in here, teenagers, I didn't know how to be an astronaut. It wasn't like I came from a family of astronauts, or my mom and dad didn't even go to college. But a family friend said, you should read The Right Stuff. And so I read The Right Stuff, and it's this amazing book. It's like the best book you've ever read. It was really spectacular. Tom Wolfe. The movie's really good too. It's 40 years old. It's aged really well, the movie The Right Stuff. But it was about Chuck Yeager and the early astronauts, the early Mercury astronauts. So if you like space, I highly recommend reading The Right Stuff. But that told me what to do, to be a fighter pilot and then test pilot and then astronaut. And I said, well, that sounds pretty cool. So that was the direction that I took. But because reading was really important to me as a kid, I didn't like reading the English books, like Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet. Made me want to go jump off the roof. But Arthur Clarke I loved. Rendezvous with Rama, I still remember reading that. There's a Jose Farmer, The River trilogy, a lot of Isaac Asimov. So I love those kind of books. I used to read mountain climbing books. So for kids, it's really important to find books that they like. And as long as they're reading something, that's the key. Find something that you like and read. And there's probably nothing better for your success in life than reading. It really is so important. Even though I'm a math and science guy and I should be saying STEM, reading is kind of the foundation for everything. So find something that your kids like and let them read that. As a kid's book idea, during COVID, my daughter's at CU Boulder as an English major and a French major. We went out and got a Airbnb, and we were just hanging out in the mountains to get away from people. And So I had this idea for a kid's book called Ask an Astronaut 100 Questions. And it was just going to be, because kids love questions. We'll do questions as soon as I'm done here. So I thought of 100 questions with input from my friends' kids. You know, they had some 10-year-olds and they gave me ideas. So I wrote out 100 questions and answers, a couple paragraphs, and the publisher liked it. Workman was my publisher. It's a great publisher, by the way. I love Workman. And after I turned it in, they said, well, let's turn it into like a story. So they kind of took the questions that I had answered and they rearranged them into a logical story. So it starts off with early astronauts, and then it's, you know, how do you train to be an astronaut, and how do you launch, and then life in space, and how do you land. And so it walks you through a space mission. Basically, they took the answer to my questions and then put it in that order and got it written for the right age. And then they got it illustrated too, and I love the illustrator. They sent me the illustrator, and I didn't like what he had done before. And anyway, but I absolutely love the layout of the book. I think is really beautiful. And there's activities in there. So there's like, how does it feel to float, and like how you can go in the pool and pretend like you're floating, or what were some of the other activities? Weightlessness. So if you get on a swing, at the bottom of the swing, you're smashed down. That's like high G forces. But at the top of the swing, you're floating for a second. So that, you know, half a second, you can feel like what it feels like in space, actually. How to do astronaut exercises and workouts. So there's little like activities for kids to do, which is pretty cool. And there's a lot of sidebars, and there's some actual photos. And anyway, hopefully it's a book that some kid will read and decide they want to grow up and be an astronaut, or be a scientist, or be an engineer, or whatever. So that's my story as an author. And as far as the space missions go, I think what I want to do is just do Q&A. So at my first flight, well, I was an F-16 pilot in the Air Force, and then test pilot, kind of like the Mercury guys. And then I was at NASA for a long time before my first flight. Eventually flew on Endeavour on STS-130, and we brought up the final 2 modules for the space station. So we were like ISS assembly complete after our flight. And it was Node 3, which is a living module, and then the Cupola, which is this really cool 7-windowed module where I took lots of pictures. There's some poor guy in Houston whose job is to count how many pictures you've taken, and so he told me that I took the most ever. It was over 319,000. A lot of those were for the IMAX movie, A Beautiful Planet. And by the way, I highly recommend that movie. It's a great film. Tony Myers was involved, well, since the 60s, at the very beginning with Graham Ferguson and IMAX, but she was our director. So she kind of was my mentor. I want to direct now. I directed a documentary, not a short film, a featured documentary called One More Orbit. And I'm hoping to get involved in that for scripted things. So Tony was my mentor, but Beautiful Planet is a great film, but that was probably the most important, the best thing I did while I was at NASA, because millions of people are going to see the movie. We did a premiere in New York City, and then one at the Air and Space Museum in DC. And the head of the Air and Space Museum said, yeah, Terry, like 1 million or millions of people are going to see this. It'll take a decade or several decades, but that was a lot of fun. So I flew in the shuttle. We finished building the station. I was the pilot. And then I went back 4 or 5 years later, flew with the Russians on a Soyuz capsule. And the shuttle flight was 2 weeks long. My second flight was 200 days. It was supposed to be 169 days, and it ended up getting extended to 200 days because of a bunch of rockets were blowing up, and they decided they wanted to do an investigation before they launched our replacement crew, and they didn't want us to come back to Earth until the replacement crew was there. So we were literally stuck not knowing how long it would be. So actually during COVID, I wrote like a mini 10 reasons why being stuck in COVID was like being stuck in space. Anyway, so that's my career story. Since I've left NASA, I've been writing books. I do a lot of speaking and do some consulting in the energy industry, actually. So I'm trying to avoid having a job as long as I can, is my goal. So with that, I think what I'd like to do is just open it up for questions, because there's probably lots of questions. Just raise your hand. Yes, sir.
Having just gone through like the college admissions process, I'm kind of interested on what did you major in, and then how did you use what you studied in university to like transfer to your post-graduate work in math?
Okay. So I went to the Air Force Academy and majored in applied math. I was an astronautical engineer when I started off, and then as a sophomore, we had to write programs. That's what astro majors do. And we were using Fortran back in the day. And I stayed up all night debugging a Fortran program. I misspelled the word read. And I went in the next day and switched to math. I'm like, I'm done with writing programs. And applied math was basically the same thing as all my engineer friends were doing, just without writing all these computer programs. And then I minored in French, which is why I got picked to be an astronaut, because I had done this exchange at the French Air Force Academy. And when I applied, the chief astronaut 10 years before me had also minored in French and also done the same exchange at the French Air Force Academy. And it's the International Space Station, so foreign languages are really important, and being able to work with foreign people is important. And so that international experience is why my minor was actually way more important than my major, ironically. And most people say, you know, you don't use your major 10 years after college or 20 years after college. Well, 1 week out of college, I went to pilot training and I was flying. So I was not using my major really ever as a pilot. You have to do math in public quickly as a fighter pilot. So like the math you learn in 6th or 7th grade, just basic, like you're 10 miles away and you have to lose 5,000 feet. So what angle, like that kind of math as a pilot you use all the time. But the super advanced complex analysis and linear algebra and stuff, you don't use that as a pilot. At test pilot school, you do use some. It's a pseudo-technical thing. It's still not like PhD aerospace engineer or anything, but so yeah, most people say your college major is important maybe for your first couple jobs, but for mine, I literally went, there's basket weaving majors that are pilots in the Air Force, so. But if you want to be a test pilot, if you want to be an astronaut, you need a technical degree.
So what chronic weightlessness? You know, it's like you're in orbit, you're in constant free fall.
Right.
You jump off, you know, and you feel that
right.
stomach.
Right.
Does that go away eventually and you adapt, or what's
Yeah.
it like to be chronically in that state?
Yeah. So as soon as they shut the engines down, you're floating, and it feels like you're falling, right? So if I take my Coke here, because you're falling, and drop it, 1 second later it'll hit the ground, right? Or whatever. In space, you're only a couple hundred miles away from Earth, so the gravity is almost as strong. So if you drop this in space, it'll fall about the same distance. The difference is during that 1 second, it moved 5 miles that way. So falling and moving forward and falling and moving forward makes a curve. And if you're at the right speed, which is a little over 17,000 miles an hour, it's the shape of the Earth. That's the orbit. So the feeling is that you're falling, and you can get that on Earth. You can go off a diving board. We used to have diving boards before we had lawyers. Or you can be in an airplane, you can push forward and you can get a few seconds. There's a jet called Zero G Corporation. I just did a YouTube video for them. It just got posted, I think, like a week ago. We were playing soccer. We filmed it back during the World Cup. So you could go on the moon. You push over a little bit less and you get 1/6 gravity, just like on the moon. So you can get that feeling on Earth for a little bit, but in space it's constant. So my first mission, man, I had the raging headache for 2 days. The first couple hours I felt barfy, like I threw up. It was not fun. It was miserable. The first 2 days were miserable. And then the morning of the third day, it was like a light switch went on, and all of a sudden I was fine. Like my brain was trying to rewire itself, and finally it figured it out. So, and then after that, you still have to learn how to move. So like in space, if I wanted to throw this to you, on Earth, I would like throw it up and it would arc over and come down. In space, that doesn't happen. So you have to like do this, but 100% of the time you end up throwing it high because your brain knows there's gravity and your brain compensates. And so it takes you time to unlearn that. Then you move with your hands and you carry things with your feet. So if you push off, all this stuff's in my book, by the way, you're gonna read the same thing. But when you push off, it takes time before you get to the right spot, but you also, not only do you translate, you rotate. And so as you're moving, you're gonna start spinning, and it takes you time. So I ended up just bouncing into walls backwards like And once you let go, there's nothing you can do until you get to where you're going. Like you're just, so it just takes time. But the one really interesting thing, so your balance system, there's 3 real components to it. There's the somatosensory, so I can tell Earth is that way because my feet feel pressure, right? Or all your guys' butts feel pressure because you're sitting on them. You know up is this way because you can see me. And so you get the force signal to your brain, you get the visual signal to your brain. And if you close your eyes, you can tell that you're rotating and moving because of the semicircular canals. It's a rate gyro sensor that F-16s have and space shuttles have and any kind of your DJI drones. Your iPhone has a rate sensor in it. Our brains were designed the same as the Apple engineers. They know X, Y, or pitch, roll, and yaw. And in space, that doesn't work because that's the little cilia, the little hairs in the canal can tell when the fluid, if your fluid move your hair in one direction, your brain knows that you're moving in the other direction, right? So these 3 little semicircular canals have hairs in them, and they can tell that you're pitching when your eyes are closed. And in space, the fluid floats, and your brain is getting this one signal that is completely messed up, and you're falling, and there's no force, so your other signal is completely messed up. So 2 of the 3 signals, the only system that works is your visual system. So I never really tried it on my first flight, but on my second flight, I had a lot of time. Whenever I closed my eyes, I was pitching forward and yawing right and rolling left. I was doing this. And then as soon as I opened my eyes up, I was back. And literally for months, and the NASA doctors just don't know, they don't understand the balance system very well at all. Some of the problems we have are similar to older people tend to get balance problems, and it's the same kind of thing. Anyway, that pitching and rolling sensation was really bizarre. 100% of the time, as soon as I took away the final remaining signal, my brain thought I was doing this, and then as soon as I opened my eyes, it would figure it out. And one of the nice things about zero G is you can if you're working on underneath that stool, there's a little step over there. You can just flip upside down and look in there, and you don't have to do this. You just put yourself in the position that makes no sense. So whenever you crawl out of a cabinet or a whatever, it would take me about 2 or 3 seconds to go, all right, up is that way. It just takes my brain about 2 or 3 seconds to get recalibrated. That was me. There was another really weird thing that I was an astronaut for 10 years before I flew, and I was in space for a couple days, and one of the guys that had flown before, he said, Terry, tap your feet. So just do that. And you don't wear shoes in space, you just wear socks. Because you don't need shoes, you're not walking, and then you can shoes are bad, you kick things, and so you just have socks. So I did that, and I was like, it was like electric shock in my body. And I had never heard this before, but apparently some astronauts feel this. And I got back to Earth, and I asked the doctors, I'm like, what the heck? And he said, oh yeah, some guys get this problem where as you grow, I grew a couple inches, your nerves and your muscles, if they expand at different rates, your nerves get really sensitive. And I had it, and in my chest, it was really bad. I thought I had ripped my chest muscle, but it was just the nerves in there. It felt like I had some type of pec injury from moving. And when you're a rookie, you do things too fast and too hard, and it takes time to learn to just go slow and be gentle. But that sensation was crazy. I'd never heard of that. I'd never heard anyone else ever say anything, but I had the same thing. I was on a NPR show called 1A last week with Eileen Collins, who's a famous astronaut. She's a good friend of mine, and she was like, I had the same thing, and we just don't talk to each other, like that. She had experienced the same thing. Yes.
Did you lose a lot of muscle mass in that 200-day stretch?
Yeah. So I think you're gonna say, did you lose a lot of weight? And I lost all my weight, but like most weight loss programs, I gained it all back. For muscle mass, so bone and muscle is the big thing. And NASA came up with this workout protocol. They give you 2.5 hours a day. They have a weightlifting machine you're not lifting weights, you're pulling against a vacuum. but you can put 600 pounds of deadlift or bench press or squats. It's weight. You have to be careful that you can put a lot of weight on that thing. We have a treadmill and we have a bike. So 2.5 hours a day doing those 3 things. Plus I took a vitamin D tablet every day because you don't get vitamin D in space. There's no sun. There is sun, but you're in a can. And the windows all have ultraviolet coating, so your body doesn't naturally produce vitamin D. It's 2.5 hours a day. I did a DEXA scan before I launched, which is an x-ray for bone density, not muscle. And then I did one 7 months later after I got back, and I had lost 0.0% of my bone density. Some bones were actually stronger, some were weaker, but my overall total body was no change, which I was blown away. So the exercise protocol has shown that you can live and work in space for a long time as long as you have these exercise machines. As far as strength goes, they do all kinds of testing, and I don't know, the week after I got back, I did 20 pull-ups, so I was in pretty good shape. Like, it was like a health spa, you know, no McDonald's and 2.5 hours of work. I was in really good shape. I had little skinny legs, but other than that, it was pretty good. So yeah, that's not a problem. The problem is radiation. That's the real long pole in the tent for any kind of long duration exploration. Yeah.
Are you monitored regularly? I mean, Barbara Morgan talked about a phone that will heal.
Yeah.
For example.
She just texted me yesterday, actually. Barb was wonderful. She was a backup for Krista McCullough on Challenger. And then she ended up getting picked a decade later for the class of 98. She's the nicest person you'll ever meet. They do periodic exams. They're kind of basic stuff, but they don't cover all your healthcare. So like when I go to get my skin cancer taken care of, NASA doesn't cover that. So unless you can remember when you go to visit the NASA doc, and it's like, what's your eyesight? They do blood work. It's just a basic physical kind of thing, periodic. But unless you remember to tell them everything that you've done in the last year or two since you had your physical, they don't get that data. So it's a really bad longitudinal, it's called the Longitudinal Study of Astronaut Health, and it's a really bad one because the only way to make it good would be to get all your data. Like they would need to get all the healthcare appointments that you do, which is unfortunate because that's important information and they're not getting it. Unless you can remember, but I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, you know, so yeah. There's no way I can remember what every doctor's appointment for the last year or two said. Yes?
So I know that when you get up there and you're weightless, I'm sure it's real difficult to fall asleep for a while. What's it like coming down and then like lying down and feeling gravity for
yeah.
a while?
That's a great question. Actually sleeping, I thought it was gonna be a problem. It wasn't a problem. Because I worked so much, I was just wiped out. I was able to sleep, get in a sleeping bag, I put it over my whole head and I slept just fine. But coming back, my first flight, first of all, you feel very heavy and you feel very dizzy. Like I could walk, I was fine, but I wanted somebody next to me just in case. So we did our walk around of the shuttle, did a quick press thing, did a bunch of medical tests, and finally I was back in my crew quarters a couple hours after landing. And I laid down, the first thing I did, I sat on the bed and I turned the TV on and it was CNN. And like, I don't know what was happening that night. And it was the most meaningless thing. It was like fingernails on chalkboard. I literally had to jump up and I couldn't jump up, but I had to crawl over and turn the TV off because it was so meaningless. I was just in outer space seeing the planet, seeing the universe, and they're talking about Kim Kardashian and Trump getting indicted or whatever it was in 2010. And I'm like, oh my God. So that was the first thing. The second thing, when I went to bed, I put the blanket. It was like a lead, like I was at the dentist office, you know, with a lead blanket. And I felt like I was a superhero and there was some bad guy with a magnet ray that had me pinned to the bed. Because I just felt really heavy. When I was still in the shuttle before I even got out, I was the pilot, so I had to shut off all the APUs. And anyway, they came in and said, Terry, it's your turn. So I got my helmet and I was like, be careful, this thing weighs 500 pounds. Yeah, I felt very heavy. Oh, question.
Yes, we're big fans of For All Mankind. You talked about wanting to do scripted, I don't know if you're talking about TV or film, so yeah. What would your idea be?
I'd like to do both. I've actually written a series about the Columbia accident. I'm shooting a short film in 2 weeks about that in LA. So I have a lot of ideas. I have a couple of really cool baseball ideas. I'm a baseball guy. I have some short film ideas about gun violence that I like to do, but I really liked it. And when I did this documentary about One More Orbit, we did a world record flying around the planet, and it was too late for me to get checked out to fly the plane. And I wanted to be a director, and so the guy's like, well, why don't you make a movie about it? Got a great budget for it, so it was really cool. But yeah, I have a lot of ideas. I've read a few books about how to write screenplays, and I've written a few, and I'm reading a book called How to Direct Actors right now, so I really like that stuff. It's cool. Yes?
What's your baseball team?
So I grew up in Baltimore, and I've lived in Houston for the last 20 years. So I'm an lifelong Orioles fan, but I'm definitely an Astros fan too. I've spent many, many, many thousands of dollars going to see Astros playoff games in the last, which is great actually. It's been a good decade to be an Astros fan.
Yeah.
The best part about it is that they beat the Yankees every year, 100% of the time. It's been the best decade to be a baseball fan. Yes.
I'm interested in the international aspects of the International Space Station. And you mentioned French and their international exchange was really helpful. And I know the space station has been operated by a consortium of, I think, US, Canada, Japan, Russia, and European Union.
Right.
So multiple countries, not always going along in Earth politics. And in the agreement for the International Space Station, there's even a provision for criminal prosecutions in case there were a crime on the space station. So can you comment on kind of how people get along, or the social situations on the space station, and does the commander have to exercise disciplinary authority, or how do people work this out?
That's a great question. So space laws are like it's an important part of law, and the code of conduct for the crew is important. Well, I was lucky when I was there, when I was commander on Expedition 43, we had a really good team, and we didn't have any problems like that. It was also in 2014, it was when Russia first invaded Ukraine, or began the invasion that's still ongoing, to be precise. They shot down the Dutch airliner, killed 200 and some people. We put sanctions on them, so it was a really tense time. And we knew that, the Russians knew this. So we just had to say, look, politics is politics. We're gonna try to not die while we're in space. Like we're on this dangerous mission, let's just work together. And the people in the Russian space program know what a great deal they have on the ISS. That's gonna end soon. And their future partner is gonna be China, and their relationship with China is going to be different than their relationship with us. They're very much equals. We've had a very good relationship with them, and that's going to be different in the future. So the average guy in the Russian program was, I think, thankful to have the ISS. And I spent the last 5 or 6 years talking, and one of the slides I show is how I got to see politics from space, which I never expected. But you can see some areas are very dark, where they have terrible governments and there's no wealth, and some areas like Western Europe or America, whatever. I-95 was the first thing I saw. The shuttle did a roll to heads up maneuver, and I could see from all the way up the East Coast, I-95. And anyway, so you can see things like this from space. And I always talked about how it felt like it was 1930 and 1940 wasn't that far away. We're in 1942 right now. It's 1943 with what Russia has done in Ukraine. And so that's been extremely frustrating, or hurtful to me, that these people that we were, cooperating, that I thought were great. 3 of the cosmonauts I flew with are now in the Duma promoting the war, they're, pro-war. I was going to text my buddy a happy birthday the other day, and his WhatsApp icon is this big Russian thing. Anyway, it's been incredibly disappointing to see these people that should be the most enlightened humans on Earth. Most of them are totally on board with Putin, and that's been very maddening. I know one who isn't. In fact, his daughter is in LA. She's going to be my script supervisor next week. He's been over to my house a couple times. He's the only Russian I know that's spoken out against Putin, and he didn't get arrested because he's a very famous, well-known guy. But anyway, so yeah, it's been an important thing. I think the international cooperation has probably been the most successful of all the stuff that's come out of the space station. The engineering, the science, the cooperation has probably been the most important. But the last year has been disappointing, to say the least.
I have a real question.
Yeah.
There's that great crew photo of Expedition 42 that's based on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Whose idea was that?
Samantha.
Okay.
Samantha Cristoforetti. So she's a big nerd, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So if you ever read the book, the answer to life and the universe and everything or something is 42. It's satire. And also Don't Panic. And so Samantha she was the rookie and she wanted to do it. So we're like, okay, go do it, And then when I was 43, and so she came up with Metropolis. There's a really famous, the first ever science fiction, Fritz Lang, German. It's a really cool movie. I watched it during COVID. Very dystopian future, everybody's working in these terrible factories, and it's a really cool movie called Metropolis. And so our poster was Metropol ISS. Which is cool. And instead they have that robot with the head. If you've ever seen the Metropolis poster, so we have Robonaut, that was this big giant robot that NASA paid for, was our Metropolis poster child. Yes.
You mentioned aliens, so what's the answer on that?
Are there aliens?
Just in the last year, there's been a lot of videos released of those. Just wanted your take on that.
Yeah. So I have a podcast called Down to Earth with Terry Virts. The editor quit, so we're kind of on hold for now. But for the last year and a half, I've been doing it, and I've had a couple UFO guys on. They've been by far my most popular episodes. There's a guy named Chris Mellon, who's the guy that got those videos released. He was Undersecretary of Defense. Ran the Senate Intel Committee. He is a legit guy, very, very serious, legit guy. And he knew, and he pushed to get the Pentagon to release these videos. There's another guy named Lou Elizondo. If you've ever seen any of the alien documentaries on TV and stuff, he's always one of the ones they interview. And another guy named, I think it's Paul Hynek. His dad was the Project Blue Book guy. So he was another interesting character on my podcast. His was really interesting until he started talking about mushrooms and stuff, and I'm like, dude, we can't talk about that. Anyway, but they have videos. These pilots have seen things, and as a fighter pilot, when you wake up in the morning, your goal for the day is to not see an alien. This is not the UFO club that's reporting these things. These are, military people who don't want to see things like this. They've got videos and radar tracks of these objects that are moving really fast, faster than they should be able to move. So I don't know what they are. They have some data. We haven't seen all the data. I'm sure there's other data somewhere. So I don't know. The bottom line for aliens is there's a lot of planets out there. There's billions of planets out there. So you'd think if there's life here, there must be life somewhere else. But on the other hand, I did a lot of experiments on my own body, like my eyeball and my brain, ultrasound, and life is really complicated. The simplest single cell amoeba. My son he was a chemical engineer, he's in med school now. He told me there's between millions and trillions of molecules in one cell. So those just wouldn't all randomly immediately align with DNA and replication and everything. I think somebody has to be involved in making life, from a scientific point of view. That's amoeba is way more complicated than this watch. And somebody had to make the watch, wind and lightning and rain didn't make the watch. So there's a lot of planets out there on the one hand. Life is super complicated on the other. And at the end of the day, they're really, 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 really far away. Proxima Centauri is a little over 4 light years away. So I think Voyager, New Horizons, was the fastest thing we've ever launched, and it would take it 70,000 years to get to the nearest star. And that's just this, right? you can't have a crew in that thing. So to get any kind of technology that can get to other star systems is many generations to get there. So so I don't know. How's that? I should be a politician. What other questions?
You were mentioning your colleagues as enlightened people.
Yeah.
And
well,
yeah,
they should be. Yeah.
That having that experience, spending more than 200 days away from the planet, must give you a very unique perspective. What would you say would be your main thought about the Earth, humanity after that experience?
Yeah, people say, like, how did it change you? I'm a lot less of a black and white person, I think. It's easy when you're young to be black and white, and I can see things in shades of gray. Most things are shades of gray. What's happening in Ukraine is not gray, that's black, right? They're white or whatever. It's not, there's no compromise in that. But most things on Earth are, when you see the planet, it's like, man, it's been there for a long time, and it's gonna be around for a long time. So I don't get as, I think my highs and lows are less. It's like, okay, it's all gonna be okay. So that's one of the things. But the other thing, I didn't show the pictures, but there really are large parts of Earth where there's no lights on. And so that's wealth and politics. Like North Korea, South Korea is the most stark example. South Korea is incredible, lights everywhere. I flew F-16s there in the early 90s, and it was a developing country. It's a developed country now. I was there a few years ago. It's way more modern than America. It's like the South Koreans have done lots of stuff well. And then North Korea is just a black hole. There's a little white dot where Pyongyang is, and that's it. And so you can see how people live from space on Earth. And this idea about it's 1930 and 1940s coming, and when you look around the world, this authoritarian dictatorship, Orwell would be so jealous if he saw what's happening in China now. The Chinese Communist Party has made an impressive surveillance state. And so I like space, but like if we're not careful, this world can be an Orwellian nightmare. I mean, that's possible. Things like AI and surveillance and social networks, they're a lot smarter than our brain. So we have to figure out how to get that under control, I think. Because we don't want that to win. I think we want democracy to win.
So
yes.
Is there any provision on the space shuttle for, like, if there were an impulse for nuclear detonation?
Yeah.
Like on Apollo, it was all root core memory, right?
Right.
Virtually indestructible. What's used on the space station?
It's 386s. NASA bought thousands of 386s back in the 90s. Because once NASA buys something, they never want to change it, right? If it works, going to the JSC is it's like the 1960s museum. And Russia is even way worse than that. But the space station runs on 386s. And Linux is the software system that runs it. And most of it is controlled from the ground. The crew can control things, but in general, we'll let some engineer on the ground do that, because we have to actually fix the box that's broken, or we have to operate on the mice or whatever, so they try and free up crew time. So if it could take out a 386, it could take out the space station. And there's lots of little modems on the outside too.
What is a 386?
Oh my God, I'm old. So back in the day, there used to be, when Microsoft first came out, they had 286s were DOS machines, and the 386 chip, that was the first Windows machine, like in the early 90s or something. And then there was the 486, that was big news in like 1993 or whatever.
I think 86.
And then they did Pentiums. Well, yeah. So Intel used to put 86 at the end of their chips. So 386 is just a 30-year-old chip. So basically, we're running on 30-year-old laptops. Yes.
Earlier, you were talking about having, a more enlightened perspective, having seen things in a different context. Do you find yourself getting into the trappings of, I guess, the mindset of everybody else around you? How do you kind of reset? How do you remind yourself that, wow, these are all small peanuts?
Yeah. you know what, I can just like close my eyes and go back to the station, or I can watch a video and go, oh, I remember this. Well, I told you the story about when I first landed from Earth or from space, and I turned on CNN and I was like, oh my God, turn it off. The worst thing, that was before these. These things, there you go. Max Scherzer had a glove incident. The Mets ace, the Orioles and Nationals are playing, so I get all my baseball alerts. But you get in Fox News. I read all news. I try and get different perspectives, but they always do the clickbait, like star found dead, or they don't tell you what happened in that, so you have to click on it. So you can. The Air Force had an acronym called CPA, Continuous Partial Attention. And their senior leaders are in continuous partial attention because they're just fixated on their email constantly. So you need to figure out a way to get rid of that stuff. I did 2 training events with NASA called NOLS, National Outdoor Leadership School. And we went to Alaska and did sea kayaking for like 2 weeks. And there was no internet in the Alaskan wilderness, which was really good. It's really good to detox yourself from that. That's one way to help. And the other thing, the last couple of years has been like massive numbers of people just ignore reality. Like, I can't explain it other than cable news works and social net. There's a reason why Google's worth $1 trillion. Those algorithms are better than our brains. And so kids, especially, you guys need to learn discernment. And is this really true? And ask questions, critical thinking. Those skills are so important because the algorithms will overwhelm your brain unless you can really think critically and ask yourself, is this real? Or, I think that's like to me, that's kind of what worries me more than anything. But critical thinking is super important for kids. Don't just believe what you're told, ask why. Be the annoying student. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much, by the way. This is really enlightening. I just wanted to step back in something you said. You used the metaphor of a watchmaker.
Mm-hmm.
And when addressing the question about aliens.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered, without getting into religion or being very esoteric about it, did the experience of living in space for 200 days, did it change your spiritual being?
Mm-hmm.
And again, taking religious out of religion.
Yeah. I totally agree. So I'm a Christian. I was a Christian before I launched. I still am. I think a lot less. I'm super disappointed in the church, to say the least, here in America recently. But even just from a scientific point of view, like the universe is incredible. Like the life is incredible. To see in the back of your eye is amazing. And religion has been used throughout history as just a way to control people and make money and keep yourself in power, which is what Jesus came to fight against, right? He was the ultimate anti-religion guy. So I don't get too uptight about that. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East in the last couple of years, and I have a lot of good Arab friends. And anyway, so my time in space, I think, was more like, don't be so uptight about that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, like, it really is an amazing universe. I love physics. I love astrophysics and like the fundamental forces. How I have a lady on my podcast she was at NC State, Katie Mack's her name, talking about the end of the universe. She has a great book called The End of the Universe or something. She has another one coming out soon. How It All Ends. There you go. It's a really uplifting book. It's yeah. But she was on my podcast. Right. Either like it goes out and then comes back on itself, but now we don't think that's going to happen because of dark energy and it's going to keep on. And then there's the big rip where everything just super expands, and then there's the vacuum decay. Anyway, there's really cool ways that we're all going to die, but like many, many billions of years in the future. But I love that stuff. I love learning how the universe works and is made. Yes?
What was your favorite food on the space station?
Favorite food?
What are your thoughts on the pitch clock?
So the food was probably shrimp cocktail or chocolate pudding cake. Those were good. And the pitch clock, they need to add a few seconds. It's just too rushed. And it's changing the game. Like what you don't want is umpires to change the game. And balls and strikes matter. And the first time in October when somebody walks in a run because they took too long, you know, anyway. I think they just went too far. It should be like 20 and 25 seconds. The first time it should be a warning. I'm glad it's better. I hated those. There's a funny video. How many I'm sorry for the non-baseball people here. You got to Google this. How many inside the park home runs can Jose Altuve hit before? So there's some pitcher out there and he's goofing around, and in the corner they show Jose Altuve running around doing an inside the park home run. And then he finally comes up and he shakes off the signal and then he throws over to first base. And then the batter backs away and he's run around 3 or 4 times and the batter's doing his batting gloves, and he does 7 times how long it takes for him to do inside the park home run before he pitches one pitch. So I'm glad it's not that anymore. The Yankees and Red Sox were the worst at that, but I just think they went too far and they need to back it off. But I'm glad there's no more shift. I'm glad that there's more steals. You know, that stuff's fun, and the shift was just whose analytics department had the best analytics department. I want to see who the best athletes are, not who the best nerds are. And I'm friends with Sigma Dahl, is the guy responsible for that. He's a really good friend. I'm going to sit in his seats at the Orioles game next week. So you can blame him for that. And it's super smart, and I'm glad the Astros have been so good because of Sigma Dahl. But I'm glad they kind of backed it off. They just went a little too far. Sorry for I could do a whole talk about baseball if you want to do one of those. I want to go. I checked that the Bulls are not in town tonight. Yeah. They're in Seattle somewhere. Yes.
Would you consider yourself an introvert or an extrovert?
What was that Briggs-Myers personality inventory, the ESTPJ? I was always right in the middle of all those things. So I'm an extrovert until my social bucket's full, and then I'm done. Like then I want to go back to my room and be alone. But I like to do this for some amount of time, but like I've had 3 middle schools today and now this, so like my social bucket's probably done after this. And all those personality things, I was right in the middle. I don't have like a really extreme personality one way or another, which is probably good for astronauts, to be honest, because you don't want the super annoying guy or the super OCD guy, although I'm pretty OCD, but you want kind of a mellow person that can not be extreme.
So isolation was difficult.
Well, no, I mean, there were 6, there was either 3 or 6 people there. I like to be alone and work by myself, and then at night you get together and have dinner together. So it was like a good mix of being alone and having some time together. I have friends who are serious introverts, and they send all the memes like, introverts of the world unite, alone at home by yourself, right? So that was anyway, it was good to have a mix, mostly by yourself, but you get together and do stuff together too. All right, one more question, and then we're all kicked out. Any good ones? No? Kids?
Would you go back if you offered a SpaceX lift?
Would I go back? I would. I always said I'd go back if I could make a movie. I'd never say never. I don't plan on it, but yeah, probably. If there's enough zeros, I would probably go back. So we'll see.
Can I ask one more
Sure.
question? How many astronauts have there been?
I just saw a thing. I was like number 500 and something. They tell you, like the NASA PAO person says, and I think it's over. I just saw something on LinkedIn or some email or something that said there's over 600 now. So it's not a lot. I mean, it's been over 60 years, so it's like 10 a year. Now with the civilian guys, there's that number will go up some amount, but yes.
You said the biggest danger is radiation.
Yeah.
Of those 600, does anybody have radiation damage? Or?
Well, I have skin cancer. Several of my friends have died from cancer. But the NASA docs are like, you don't know it's from space. Yeah. The N is so small. A lot of those 600 were short duration missions, so they weren't up for very long. So
is it totally enclosed for radiation in the spacecraft?
It's a aluminum. It's that thick aluminum, and so electromagnetic radiation, so radio waves or ultraviolet or that doesn't get through metal for the most part. But part and electrons don't get through, but alpha particles can, and galactic cosmic radiation, which is like super fast, 0.9 the speed of light, molecules, those things go right through. And on my 5th night in space, I was going to bed, I closed my eyes and I saw this giant white flash, and I was like, cool, that's what the Apollo guys saw. And then it's like, until you think about what's happening, these super energetic, they call it ionizing radiation because it ionizes your cells, was hitting my optic nerve, and it makes you see a flash. There's no sound, you just see this flash. And I write about that in the book. And it mostly happens over the South Atlantic anomaly. There's this, the BBC did a documentary called Anomaly with me, and the magnetic field dips over the South Atlantic. There's something in the middle of the Earth, the iron is spinning differently or something. And it causes a lot more radiation to happen, because the magnetic field's kind of like a force field. It doesn't block everything, but it helps. But yeah, that radiation can go through, and NASA measures how much radiation you get, but it's like one number, but there's not all, it's like Animal Farm, not all radiation is equal. And the kinds of radiation you get in space just doesn't exist on Earth, because as soon as they hit an oxygen molecule, it would scatter and turn into lower energy radiation. So it's a super interesting thing. NASA, I think they might be doing it now, and I've been very disappointed. I didn't know this until after I got back, but they don't do before and after DNA testing, which is the most basic thing. I'm just a fighter pilot, but I want to know how it affected my DNA. So they did take blood samples. So there's somebody who's going back and looking at blood samples to see if our DNA was affected, which that's like an important question. I don't think they want to know the answer. I think that's why they haven't been studying it.
So did you like Top Gun 2?
I did like Top Gun 2. Yeah. Top Gun 1 was the best. I mean, it came out when I was in college. That's what, I have every line memorized from that. It was good. It was Top Gun 1 with modern CG, the same story, the same, everything. It was the movie we needed, I think. It's not real, it's fake, but it's like going to the movies for fun. And so I liked it. And the good guys win. And I don't know, it was the movie that we needed. I'm glad they made it. I'm going to meet the CEO of the company that financed it next week when I'm in Hollywood. So, all right. Well, thank you guys for coming. Anybody, I think I've signed everybody's books, but if anybody needs something signed, let me know.
Yeah, and remember, there's goodies in the back. There's some temporary tattoos, some buttons, so feel free to grab some stuff.
Is that your tattoo? I was like, well, she got a robot tattoo. And I was like, no, wait a minute, that's not a real tattoo.
It's kind of represents it.
Yeah, that's cool. That's very cool.
Yeah. Don't worry about it. Yeah.
Sure. Good.